The Kent State Massacre, May 4, 1970. In the 1950s, technology changed the world, and during Vietnam, technology became one of the United States' biggest enemies. Once the public was able to watch actual footage from the war, they saw their friends, children, and family participating in horrific things. Known as the first living room war, technology brought the Vietnam War right into our homes. Images of civilians being raped and murdered played on screen. An infamous image that really sparked outrage was the image of a naked child attempting to flee an American attack. The protests that erupted were unforgiving and intense. According to the American Yap, protesters burned draft cards, refused to pay income taxes, occupied government buildings, and delayed trains loaded with war materials. By 1967, anti-war demonstrations were drawing hundreds of thousands. In one protest, hundreds were arrested after surrounding the Pentagon. Due to severe social unrest and the distrust of the government, the end of the war was nowhere in sight. Without any solid plan and the public's dislike towards him, President Johnson announced that he would not be running for re-election in 1968. After success in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert Kennedy would attempt to run for office, but would be assassinated only months after Johnson's announcement. Later, at the Chicago Democratic Convention, a protest riot breaks out, where protesters were brutally assaulted on national television. Violence is at the forefront of American life, and with television everyone can see what's happening. A violent pattern of authority versus the people is beginning. Richard Nixon's campaign directly profited off the fears that America is facing. The people he spoke directly to are often referred to as the silent majority. These were the red voters of Middle America. Basing his campaign on what would get their vote, he promised law and order, an end to the social unrest and violence, a peaceful end to the Vietnam War that would bring the state's honor, and in an attempt to appeal to youth voters, Nixon promised to phase out the draft. Nixon won 43.3% of the popular vote and 302 electoral votes, winning him the presidency. Stated in Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War, The End of the American Century, by David Schmitz, for Nixon, Vietnam's importance stemmed from its place in the global Cold War struggle to contain communism and maintain U.S. power and credibility in Southeast Asia, claiming that it was vital to the United States and the entire free world. And according to the American Yap, Nixon constantly associated liberal protests with violence and chaos, which appealed to American suburbia and the silent majority. Nixon chose his audience very carefully, and by appealing to the conservative voters, he was practically handed the presidency. As tensions built up all over the country, college campuses became the main battlegrounds for the anti-war movement. According to the History Channel's YouTube episode, The Kent State Shooting Explained, Nixon signed an executive order calling for a military strike in Cambodia, and up until then, it seemed like the U.S. was going to be less involved in the war. This was on April 28th. That night, drunk rioters protested by destroying the streets, and the next morning when students were cleaning up the mess they had made, the Ohio state government sent state militia to make sure no more violence erupted. On May 1st of 1970, Kent State held a peaceful protest against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. Students marched and held signs sharing their disagreement with the Times. The next day, things took a turn when students burnt down the campus ROTC building. The governor of Ohio promised to use law enforcement to deal with the students. On May 3rd, students waited to meet with the city officials, but none ever showed up. Hundreds of students protested by blocking traffic. Some were violent and were met with violence. On May 4th, the governor banned all public protests, but the students didn't care. 3,000 students showed up to the demonstration, but were met with 100 men armed with M1 rifles. While no one really knows what inspired them to fire, the army eventually opened fire on the students, killing 4 and injuring 9. The picture shown to the right became one of the most publicized images. 14-year-old runaway Marianne Vecchio quickly became a symbol for the disillusion of the nation. In an interview conducted a week after the shooting, Vecchio states, "Well, we were all yelling and running from the guardsmen because they were using tear gas, and naturally we were like trying to get out of there because I just had this feeling that something bad was going to happen. I saw a couple guardsmen coming closer with the tear gas, and then a canister was flying at us. Jeffrey picked it up and threw it with all of his might back at the guards. Then all of a sudden I hear screams and loud gunshots, followed by shrieks and more screaming to my left. Then I see out of the corner of my eye Jeffrey falling. I thought he had tripped or something, but then I saw blood. It was coming from his head, a thick red. He was shot in the mouth and had been killed instantly." After the Kent State Massacre, an already divided nation was torn even more, with the silent majority defending the state and the anti-war movement fighting back with even more protests. In a journal entry entitled "Social Control, Violence, and Radicalization, the Kent State Case," the author argues that this era created the idea that political and social unrest must be responded to with violence. The author states, "Relatively little research, however, has focused on the effects which the actions of social control agents like police and National Guardsmen have on student demonstrators and others, particularly where such control has involved the use of excessive force. Even now, those who question or challenge authority are often met with violence." On May 15th, 11 days after Kent State, 2 students were killed and 12 were injured at a Jackson State College protest, but by city police officers. The students at this school were black, and most of the time this case of violence is not spoken of. It is obvious that in American society, race plays a major role in the acts of violence committed against innocent people. Without the protests of the 60s and 70s, the nature of protests today would not be what they are. The past few years, student leaders have once again been on the forefront of national movements. Caitlin Bennett graduated from Kent State in 2018, and her senior photos went viral. You can see it pictured on the left. Her graduation cap says, "Come and take it," with an AR-15 pictured, and an assault rifle is across her back as well. Bennett received extreme backlash for these photos, but she also created an even bigger student conservative movement. She organized an open carry rally and was often featured on Fox News and did interviews with and for Alex Turner, an extremely controversial far-right influencer. In her tweet that first revealed her senior photo, she stated that she should have been able to open carry on a campus, or 4 unarmed students were killed by the government, with the hashtag #CampusCarryNow. Bennett's campaign is often followed by sexist, homophobic, and racist remarks, and she is extremely unpopular among liberal movements for her beliefs. On the opposite spectrum of Bennett, the March for Our Lives movement became a global movement in early 2018. In Parkland, Florida, 17 high school students were killed by another student after he opened fire on campus with an assault rifle. After this tragedy, student survivors began the March for Our Lives movement, which advocated for stronger gun control and more student protection, following the motto, "Not one more." After February 14, 2018, the single largest protest against gun violence in history was made. Millions of people participated all over the world. Many of the leaders of the movement say that the protests of the 1960s and 70s gave them their inspiration. This movement created a 47% increase in youth voting turnouts, and 46 NRA backing candidates lost their elections. When I was a senior in high school, I participated in the March for Our Lives movement. Alongside 4 other peers, I went to my school staff and explained the importance of a school-wide walkout, not only to honor the victims of Parkland, but to explain why no student should ever have to feel unsafe on their campus. My peers and I were met with teachers who we once admired, calling us ignorant to our faces. Students who disagreed threatened to shoot us, and the police showed up on our campus the day of the walkout. I will never forget the look on the principal's face when we told him we were not asking for permission to hold this rally, but telling him it was going to happen. In my speech, I advocated for stronger gun control and for a decrease in party conformity. I have since then participated in other protests and movements, but this one will always be in my heart. I experienced firsthand how authority and those in power truly fear the minds and determination of the youth. Kent State and Jackson State represent that fear as well. As long as there is youth questioning and challenging authority, there will always be violence, because authority knows that violence is all they have against us.